Okay.
Good.
And then let's get started.
All right.
All right, so I'm going to talk about different materials and methods of building bins. We all like the idea of repurposing materials. Actually, my favorite bins we'll be showing you at the end is new material, but I also use some of these ideas, and I have several bins running all the time. Probably right now about 6 or 8 bins. So I use all these methods, but sometimes, and the goal here is to make the compost bin building inexpensive. So if you have concrete blocks laying around or a source to purchase inexpensively concrete blocks, these make very sturdy bins. You got to make sure that you have firm level ground to begin with, because you're laying these blocks without any mortar or anything in between them. And you're trying to lay these blocks with spaces in between, because it's very important that a compost pile gets aeration. So that, and you can also make multiple bins with this method if you're clever enough on how you're stacking your blocks. And the best dimensions for a compost bin is normally 4 feet by 4 feet by 4 feet. I typically stick to a little lower bin, and I'll explain why later. So that using concrete block, trying to build that size is about 5 courses high, and there's 9 blocks in each course. So it would take about 45 blocks to build one bin. You might as well get a few extra. If you notice on the block in the very right-hand lower corner, I call this a double core. And what that is that gives you the ability with a block hammer or a block chisel to score that gap right in the middle, and you can break that block in half very easily. Because you're going to need some half blocks, as you see on the left side, to make a nice even stack on the end. Because what you're going to do is be putting U-posts in and wire to form the front of the bin so that you can contain more material. I didn't show that here. We'll talk about that a little bit more as we go on. Next.
Coming? There we
go. Another one of my favorites is utilizing pallet rack wire decking. And these are available in a number of areas to pick up. I use a place down in Glassboro called Fazio's. It's industrial supply material. And these wire mesh racks are used in pallet racking. And there's usually a lot of surplus left over. They're typically 4 feet deep. And again, you can get them in a number of different widths. And you build your first bin out of 3 of those wire sections. And then each additional section would require 2 more. I like buy them with bigger holes in them, because you can see that what I'm using for the slats across the front to retain the material, in this case, are bamboo poles. Those are very readily available. Typically, a lot of people are throwing them away if their property has been overrun with bamboo. So you can usually pick them up just for carting them away. That's the best material. Or you could use wire mesh. And again, we'll talk about that a little bit more as we go along. Typically 48 inches deep, 36 to 42 inches high is ideal. They cut down very easily with a power hacksaw, sawzall, things of that nature. Available, I usually pay around $12 to $19 per section. So I consider that as a pretty reasonable cost. You'll notice on the right-hand picture, the lower part, there's a rebar that gets inserted into the ground, and we'll see that in our next slide. Go ahead, go to the next slide. So the rebar is placed in the corner. I nail them in, down level with the top, and use plastic wire ties to attach to the rebar. You don't need many. It doesn't take much to make these pretty sturdy. And again, showing the bamboo slides into the smaller openings for us to enclose it. Everything on that, let's go to the next one. So now we're, again, repurposing materials. These are wooden shipping pallets. Typically, a shipping pallet is 48 inches deep. They usually are 42 to 36 inches wide. So I lay them on their sides so that the 48-inch dimension is the width of the bin, and hopefully they're not too tall to work around. So, and these are expandable with multiple. Next slide. Just showing again the pallets and the material. Again, pallets are easy to obtain. Sometimes you can get them free. You look at around at some of the businesses, they'll have them stacked to the side. If you got to buy them, there's usually vendors. You can go on Craigslist or Facebook Marketplace and find them. Sometimes they're $2.50, sometimes they're $5 a piece, but look around for free giveaways. That's what you want, right? So let's go to the next slide. Some of the materials that I use to make my job easy is a power drill. I use decking screws because they're strong, corrosion resistance, they last a long time. You'll need a sledgehammer for pounding in the rebar. There's PVC pipe. You don't have, I'll show you what the PVC pipe is all about. And a PVC cutter is handy, but a hacksaw works just as well. A heavy pair of lineman pliers, which are your wire cutters, and wire nuts. And I forgot, I should have showed the front of that package. The little blue wire nuts are ideal, and I'll explain in a minute what we use those for. Next slide. So here I'm showing where you just standing up the wooden pallets, and I'm using a deck screw, a toenail fashion, where you're just going into one strong part of the pallet into the next one. 3 or 4 screws is plenty. Makes it very solid, very stable, and extremely easy to put together and take apart when you're going to move them. You decide to get rid of it or whatever. Next. So, in talking about how to enclose the front of the bin, a couple different methods. First of all, I use these U-posts. They're available at any of the big lumber yards. Tractor Supply, I think, has them. And these posts have tabs on them for holding the wire mesh that goes across the front. But I'm going to show you a method because I like the wooden slats. They're removable. You put them on as you're building the bin up, and you take them off one at a time as you're pulling the material out of the bin. And it just makes a much neater application. You'll notice on the right view there, I have my hand spacing the post away from the pallet. And let's go to the next slide, and we'll talk about why I'm doing that. So I cut these PVC pieces. It's a 1-inch PVC pipe. I cut into spacers 1 inch long. Again, I'm using if you have a PVC cutter, it's very quick and handy. Hacksaw does work quite well. It's just a little bit more time consuming, a little bit harder. Next. So I'm taking the PVC spacer and a deck screw. These posts are pre-drilled with holes, and so I'm going to use the deck screw through the middle of the PVC pipe and screw it into the end of the pallet. Oh, I'm sorry, I forgot one thing. So I make these strips on the end of the pallet because all you really have are 3 runners. And I cut these strips out of excess plywood or whatever. You could actually use a 1x3 furring strips or 1x4 furring strips that I'll show you a little later. But yes, you do have to have something on the end of that pallet to receive the screws that we're going to put in. So once you've done this on both sides, go to the next slide. Okay. So you see what you've created are pockets to slide in. In this case, I'd be using 1x4s. That's more in kind to the other slats that are being used on the pallets. You could also use 1x3s. You just end up with a lot more space in between. And even though your goal is to get air through the pile, having spaces too large allows a lot of the material to fall out of it, which is not a problem. You just scoop it up out of the outside and throw it back on the top of the pile. It's just that in this case, 1x4s work better. So as I said, you could use these U-posts mounted directly to the end of the pallet and use the wire mesh. I'll give you the specs on this wire mesh in a minute. Notice on the right-hand picture, these are the little blue wire nuts. When you cut this wire mesh with a wire cutter, you end up with a little chisel point. And those chisel points are extremely sharp. They could literally poke an eye out. And to protect yourself or anybody else around your bins, put protection on the end of those wires. And that's what I use, these little blue wire nuts. So you're hooking the fence into the post. And you can also, in this case, you could bend those wire extensions around the post as well, and it'll be very sturdy. It's just that when you're going to access the pile, you typically have to lift off the whole front of the mesh. Next. You can see here that we can do multiple piles with the pallets, and another piece of wood to another piece of wood. And, 3 bins are ideal, or you could go more, depending on how often you're going to aerate your material by shoveling it from one bin to the other. Do we have any questions up to this point? I haven't, nobody's posted any questions or asked for clarification.
Hey, David.
No questions so far.
Go ahead. Is there a question?
Yes, I have a question. With the bins, are you putting anything under them, or are you just putting them on the grass?
Normally, I don't put anything under them. And of course, you put it right on the grass, you're going to kill the grass underneath, and well, who cares? That's less grass you got to mow, right? But what's nice is that the compost material material will encourage earth, and earth are your best addition to the composting process. They eat the scrap material that you're putting in there, kitchen scraps and the leaves and the grass clippings and so forth, and their castings are the most ideal material. So I like to encourage that. However, I've been in a couple places where if you're building your bins too close to the trees or other plant life around it, that plant life tends to want to get into your compost material, and it'll suck out the moisture and the nutrients and things like that. So if I'm going to be near roots, I will put cardboard on the bottom, and cardboard itself is going to deteriorate and decompose and be beneficial in the long run. It's just that it's harder for the earthworms to come up through. So I'd only put something on the bottom and only cardboard. Don't put plastic down or anything like that. Any other questions on this? Did I clarify that? Okay. Next. All right, so we'll get into the wire mesh bins. I like these the best because they allow for the best aeration. It's relatively inexpensive, and you can build it in different configurations. The first one you see there is just a round bin, 4 foot in diameter. Works pretty good. 5 feet is would be okay, and again 3 feet of height. I like to stay with that because it'll be easier to get in there and aerate your material. If you don't want to be bothered with aerating your material or anything like that, 4 foot high by 4 foot diameter is just fine. And again, I use one of these U-posts as the point of the two ends coming together. It does allow you to open the bin up from time to time, and expose the material and shovel it out, or clean it out, agitate it, or whatever. Next. This is by far my favorite system. It starts with I'll show you we start with a 3-sided wire mesh, and I don't know if you took notice of the specs on that first our last screen, but you can get this material at all the bigger lumber yards. And okay, skipped over it, but here we go. Comes in a 3 foot by 50 foot roll, and it has 2 inch by 4 inch holes. I think it's 16 gauge galvanizer. Also comes in black and green if you don't like the silver color. All right, let's go back to our multi bins. So I start with a 3-sided bin, and then we will add 2 sides each time we want to increase the size of the number of bins that we're going to shovel our material to. If you're doing it every couple of weeks, once a month, it'll dictate. And if you have a lot of material, when you shovel from one bin to the other, you're going to start over anew. So I find that 3 bins work the best. Usually your material is decomposed pretty well by the time it's ending in your 3rd bin. Here we're showing bamboo again being used as our slats, and we'll go on to the next slide, and we'll talk about how I accomplish this. I'm rolling out my fencing material, and the dimensions I'm using are 4 feet for side 1. I use 45 inches across the back for side 2, and again 48 inches coming forward to make our U-shaped bin. The reason why it's 45 inches across the back is that if you go with the wood slat method, those furring strips, 1x3 furring strips, come in an 8-foot length. And when you cut the 8-foot length in half, you have 4 feet. And I'll show you why that's important, so that you have overhang in each side to retain the slats in place. So I'm using my lineman pliers to cut the wire. I have a weight there because these coils are very springy, and they will simply snap back like a coil once you cut the wire. So you want something heavy laying there as you cut your material. And then I measure off my 48 inches. I'll lay a board down and stand on the board and simply lift the wire mesh up to form a 90-degree bend. So here I tried to show you these wire ends that are left are, again, extremely sharp. And before I do anything, I put a wire nut on each one of those exposed wires, because this thing will catch your clothing, your skin, everything. It's very, very dangerous to work with if not covered. And the last picture on the right there is my supervisor, Max the cat. Always curious, wants to see what's going on. All right, so I hope you can see what's happening here. In the 90-degree corner formed by bending the wire mesh up, I'm trying to form a pocket so that I'm bending every other wire in the opposite direction. So that if you look on the picture on the right there, the rebar goes through one to the inside, and the one below it, that wire has been bent inwards, so your rebar goes on the outside of that, and this is alternating all the way down, and it forms a very sturdy corner. And this rebar here is 1/2-inch rebar material, again available at the big lumber yards or down at Fazio's. They'll typically come in 5-foot length. 10-foot lengths, so that if you cut them in half, you end up with a 5-foot piece. Unless you have soft soil, it's in some cases it's difficult to drive that pin down 2 feet into the ground, because our bin is 3 feet high. And so either cut them to a 4-foot length, or I'll show you something else in a minute to protect yourself. Again, these rebars are very sharp on the ends. Okay, so what we're doing is I'm starting with the putting the rebars in 2 of the back corners, and you simply make this pound these stakes in and make the back as straight as possible. Next. And then what we want to do is square up the bin, and a couple different methods to do that. If you have a nice big framing square, you can lay that on the ground and just square it up. Or you can use the Pythagorean theorem, being one side squared plus the other side squared, and you take the square root of that, and that'll give you the diagonal. But the carpenter's trick is what they call a 3, 4, 5 right triangle, so that your front portion of the bin is 4 feet long. You simply measure 3 feet across the back, attach your tape measure to that point at 3 feet, and bring the corner to the measurement of 5 feet. So that gives you your 3, 4, 5 right triangle. Did I confuse anybody on that? Does that need clarification? somewhere I have the measurement because I know when I do, 45 and 48, I know what this is supposed to be, but I forgot to write that down somewhere. I used the Pythagorean theorem to figure that out. Okay. So when you locate that front post, you simply take your hangs here, the leftover wire, and you're bending them around the rebar. And again, that'll make a very sturdy attachment point. Next. And after all that's done, you're taking your 1x3 furring strips that I said were cut into 4-foot pieces. And as you can see, the hangover here is to allow the board to rest comfortably. And the 2-inch hole formed by here, when you have multiple bins, they both lay in the same slot quite comfortably. Might see that in our next. No, we were just attaching the little out of. Oh, I'm sorry. Yeah, what we're doing now is I'm taking my next wire section, which is measuring 45 inches across the back and 48 inches forward. And you can keep this in line just by lightest line of sight, and attach another rebar in that corner. And what you can do at this point, then your front post is going to be just 45 inches over from that one. You really don't have to think about being square as long as you have that 45-inch dimension. Those 48-inch pieces are easily resting there. Next, if your rebar sits up, sometimes you cut these things into 4-foot lengths and pound them in, and you get resistance. You hit a rock or something, and the rebar is still sticking up above the rest of the wire fencing. Keeping in mind that when you're aerating this material, you're shoveling from one bin to the other, and your arms are reaching. And I forgot to mention, the reason I like the 3-foot height is because I'm an old man and I got to lift that material up. It gets quite heavy. So when you get down to the bottom of the pile and you're lifting it way up and throwing it over to the other side, going over 4 feet is a lot of work. So that's why I like to keep it to 3 feet. And because of that nature, your arms are crossing over the top of these things. You got to protect yourselves from those rods, or your kids or your grandkids are playing in the backyard and, they go running into these things. You don't want anybody injured. So I take an old tennis ball and take a razor knife and cut an X in the bottom of the tennis ball, and you just jam it on there, and you're protected from any injuries. Do we have any questions about that up to this point? Because we're wrapping up here, and I'm just showing, the results of composting. This is material. Unfortunately, this took me about 6 months to get to that level because first of all, I started in cold weather, and second of all, I tend to not pay attention to my bins. Well worked, you can get this kind of material in a month or 2 or 3. It should not take you, 6 months to get down to that kind of material. I use a lot of my stuff as actually mulching on our flower beds and so forth. So you'll still have undecomposed material in here. And what I use is a sifter I made, shown on the right there, just a couple of pieces of 2x6 nailed together, covered with a screening material that's called a 1/2-inch hardware cloth. And this gives you a pretty fine material, more suited then to growing. If you wanted to have planting, pot soil, and you'd want it finer, you could get a 1/4-inch. This is 1/2-inch that I use. You could get a 1/4-inch hardware cloth, and you can sift it down to a pretty fine material that's ideal for planting seeds if you're doing that in the house and so forth. I think that's, is that our last slide? Yep, that's it. So did you get a chance? Okay, great. My email address is shown there, djager53@gmail.com. Contact me, send me your questions or comments and so forth.